Greetings. Welcome to the Dragon Con Urban Fantasy Track author interview series. I am joined today by longtime supporter of the track and someone I am pleased to be able to call a friend, Patricia Briggs. Thank you so much for joining us. Uh, and it's
You know I'd do anything for you, Carol.
You are very kind. Thank you very much. Now, the way I usually start these interviews, because I'm always curious to hear everyone's answers, is that did you read fantasy and or science fiction as a child or young adult?
I did. I read The Hobbit when I was in second or third grade. And then after that, my sister, Ginny, who is 4 years older than I am, was a really big science fiction fantasy reader. So I'd steal her books, much to her dismay, and read them. The first science fiction and the first fantasy I read were Andre Norton's, both of them. Let's see, Beastmaster was the first science fiction I'd ever read. And Year of the Unicorn was the first fantasy I read. And I read the science fiction before I read fantasy, but both of it, I was in elementary school for both of that. As I recall, I was homesick. So...
Oh,
but yeah, no,
that was a way to occupy yourself. Yeah.
Right. But all the way through, maybe fifth and sixth grade and on through junior high, science fiction and fantasy was all I read.
Wow,
and horse books. So.
Oh, speaking of horse books, did you ever read Afraid to Ride by C.W. Anderson?
I sure did. I have all of C.W. Anderson's books. I love them. He was not a great writer. He was a great horseman, and he taught an entire generation of kids how they should take care of the horses with the Billy and Blaze books, right? They need shelter and food and water and good farriers and all sorts of things that I have carried into the rest of my life. But mostly he was an incredible artist. His artwork, and he only drew thoroughbreds, but his artwork was just spectacular.
I hadn't actually thought about that, but I remember, and this is not an exaggeration, that I counted the number of times I read that book because I was horse obsessed when I was about, from age 10 through about 15. And I read that book for, like when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. I must have read it 19 times. And I don't recall that I read other books of his, but I read that one so many times. It was crazy. I'm surprised I don't still have it somewhere, but I digress.
Now, I'm sure you have large pieces of it memorized, but no, he was a great advocate for horses, and his children's book set a really high standard that nobody else really met. I mean, Sam Savitt was a good illustrator, and Wesley Dennis, who illustrated all of Marguerite Henry's books, right. I'm trying to think of the names of some of them. Bridie of Grand Canyon and Misty of the Chincoteague, the whole Chincoteague series with Misty of Chincoteague, and the one about the Godolphin Arabian, Something of the Wind.
Oh, yes. Anyway. Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yes.
So Wesley Dennis was an incredible artist too, but C.W. Anderson was my favorite. Oh. And he told stories of kids like you and I were, right?
Right.
Horse crazy kids.
Now, you, aside from your love of horses, you actually have a history background as well. And how do you feel that has influenced your work as a writer?
Oh, it has influenced it a lot. Yeah. Even back when I was writing traditional fantasy, most traditional fantasy is set in like a pseudo medieval world. So all the things that I learned about, where civilizations are born, how water affects that, how weather affects it, how mountains affect it, and why people come into groups and specialize, and all of those things, and then kind of an ability to research things I don't know, because the first thing you learn when you sit down to write a book is how many things that are common in your world that you don't know the name of. Things like the door sill, and the flowers that are in your backyard, and all of the things, all of that you need the names of if you're going to write a book. When you write them in a pseudo medieval world, then you're looking up things like cotter pins and how do harnesses work, and how do boats work, what parts of the boats are important, and where all of those things. And that history background has really helped me with that.
And aside from the whole research
and I
angle,
think it helps me. Oh yeah, and I use it hopefully to make my old characters feel old, so that if I have a werewolf who's 200 years old, his base character is based on somebody who was born in the early 1800s or late 1700s, and those morals and those how to treat other people and all of those things that are stuck with you when you're 10 or 15 carry through until you're 200 or 300. And I like to play a little bit with that. Mm-hmm.
Now, your first book that came out was Masks was in 1993, and that was the more traditional fantasy. And then we have you have a number of books that you wrote under the more the traditional or high fantasy type genre than it became. Then you moved into
urban sorcery was the old name for it. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yes. So what you had those, and you have a very interesting story about how you made that move from traditional fantasy into urban fantasy.
I do. So it started out with my last traditional fantasy, which were Raven Shadow and Raven Strike. And I sold for the very first time a book on speculation. I'd written Raven Shadow, told her I thought that there was I don't remember now, I'm going back. But at any rate, I sold those as a 2-book deal. And I had to write an outline for Raven Strike, which I'm terrible at outlines. They take me longer than writing the book usually. And then I'm not interested in writing the book anymore if I have an outline, because I know how it ends. Why would I write that? But anyway, so I wrote Raven Shadow and I gave them the outline for Raven Strike. And then I looked at my contracts very carefully and I could not find a due date for the second book. And I thought, wow, that's really weird and fun that they did that. Yeah, for me.
Just leaving it up to you.
I've read it twice. I assure you, I've read it twice. Exactly. And about that time, they were bringing back my old books, and they had purchased Wolfsbane, which had not been previously published, just a sequel to Mass. And Ann Sowards called me up and she said, well, we want to reprint Mass because we're going to publish Wolfsbane. And she said, but I think that you wanted to rewrite or edit Mass again. And I said, oh yes, please. She goes, thank goodness. Not quite, but it was my first book. It needed help. So I spent about, I don't know, a lot longer than I intended to revising Mass. I didn't think it would take me very long. And actually, to date, that is the most difficult thing I've ever done, is revise Mass. I wrote it when I was in my 20s. It was published before I was 30. And I was trying to revise it with the skill set of somebody who'd been writing for 15 years and was 15 or 20 years older. I don't remember exactly, but my perspectives on things had changed quite a bit. So I struggled a lot with it. And I finally got it done. I turned it in. Ann Soward said, yep, that's good. She called me up. She said, oh, by the way, as a side at the end of this conversation, she said, when are you going to turn in Raven Strike? Because it's due next week. And I said, oh, it is. And she goes, yes. And we thought we'd bring out all of your old out of print books and would pull them out and publish them like, 2 a month, 1 a month, 2 months. Before we bring out Raven Strike as sort of to build up publicity. And I went, oh, that's nice of you, which means from my perspective, we do not want to move the publishing date of Raven Strike. So I said to her, so how much time can I get before we have to move that book? So she called me back and she told me I was on page 50 and I had 6 weeks to write the book. And to this day, Raven Strike is the longest book that I've ever written. It has, I think it's 125, 130,000 words long, which is not huge if your name is Brandon Sanderson or Jim Butcher, but it is huge by my standards. And because I grew up reading Andre Norton, who never found a story that she couldn't tell in 60,000 words or less. So there I am, and I am so burned out. This book, I wrote it. I think I wrote it like 20 hours a day for 4 weeks, and then had to stop for a day or two, and then kicked it back in. I was really burnt out. So I was talking to my husband and said, I think I'm going to have to just take a year off writing. I can't hardly even write my own name. And Ann Sowards called me up and we were talking business. Ann Sowards is my editor at Penguin. And she said to me, she said, one of my boss just asked me if we had any writers in our stables who could write an urban fantasy, because they just lost a bidding war. And I don't know to this day which book it was or which author it was, but they lost a bidding war with another publishing house for an urban fantasy. And I said, and she knew I read urban fantasies because we exchanged reading lists for friends too. We exchanged reading lists. She knew that I really loved them. And she said, could you write an urban fantasy? And I went, yes, I could. Mind you, I was just going to take a year off. I'm like, yeah, I could. And they gave me pretty open guidelines. Had to be a female protagonist, which is right up my alley, involved with a complicated love life involving werewolves and vampires. But she herself did not have to be a werewolf or a vampire. And I thought that would be fun. And I sat down and wrote the first 100 pages of Mooncalled that week. So that's how I switched over to writing urban fantasy. It was fun.
Yeah, and I guess you weren't as burned out as you thought you were. Maybe just burned out on the other genre.
Exactly. I just didn't want to write another description of rooms, make up another room to write a description of. The Raven Strike is my tribute to H. Rider Haggard, right? And they come into this abandoned city, and I think that there's about I don't know. I'm not going to. There's a lot of description about abandoned buildings that were important to the book. And I got to the point where I'm like, I have to go find a magazine and open a magazine and find a room I can describe, because I'm out of them in my head. I can't make up anymore. So
enough was enough.
Enough was enough.
At that point, you probably didn't want to have to paint anything at your house.
No. Urban fantasy suited me really well because I didn't have to imagine anything. I could just walk out in the real world and go, hey, look, there's an old van again. I can just describe an old van again. There's an old bus painted up like the Mystery Machine. I'll use that. It was fun.
That's that's one of the appeals, I think, of urban fantasy, is that the world, for the most part, does look like ours, whether it's supposed to be ours or some made up city you've never heard of before or whatever. It still is a recognizable world.
I think it's a good gateway for people who are afraid of like traditional science fiction and fantasy. Like there's a pretty good steep learning curve when you step in and into something that's a traditional fantasy that is maybe a little intimidating, where urban fantasy is not intimidating at all. It's just like going out and turning on Ghost Hunters or something, or Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
That's right. Oh, extra points for you for mentioning Buffy, my all-time favorite.
That was. I remember when the movie came out. That was so much fun. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. My love is more. I mean, I enjoyed the movie, but my love is more for the series.
The series was incredible. There's no question. Yeah. So the B movie, the movie that started it all, is really just a B movie.
Right.
It's pretty, it's pretty lightweight, but the series is amazing. So,
Yep. Yet another point in your direction in your column as to why you're wonderful. So thank you. Yes. Uh, now you use a lot of
we collect
folklore.
those points.
You use a lot of folklore as background for your series, and Mercy mentions for at least in the last several installments of that series about how she was glad that she had the background in fairy tales, because she was finding out how much of fairy tales actually had some truth to them. And so my question for you is, do you have a favorite fairy tale or creature from folklore?
Oh, they're all my favorite fairy tales. And I grew up reading fairy tales. My sister, again, my sister's, she's very influential in my life. I'm lucky she's awesome. My aunt gave her a gigantic Reader's Digest book of fairy tales. I don't know. Someday I'm going to run that thing down and buy a copy for myself. But we would go to bed at night, and my mom was okay with us staying up reading. So my sister, from the time she got that when she was pretty young, and from the time I was 5 or 6, before I could read, so it must have been earlier than that, we would go to bed and she would read a fairy tale. She would pick out a fairy tale to read, and then I'd pick out a fairy tale to read. And I had a few favorites, and my favorites were kind of odd. And I can't remember. One of them was The Glass Mountain, which is a fun story. But the other one was all I can remember is that this boy had a cow who could talk to him. And the cow was slaughtered, and they would took the skin of the cow, and then he used the skin to have, like if he laid it out, it was a picnic. I mean, it was really bizarre, but for some reason, my 4-year-old heart, I just liked maybe the cow that talked to him, and then the little goose girl with Falada's head nailed up to the gate or to the bridge, talking to her. I don't now as a grown up, I kind of think my younger self was a little bit perverse, but
Or at the very least morbid, maybe.
Right, exactly. And my mom was a elementary school librarian, and every summer we would go in and help her with books or sit around the library reading while she was doing things. And so I read the whole entire 800, the Dewey Decimal System 800, which is all the fairy tales and folklore and stuff like that my school had by the time I was in like 5th or 6th grade. And so I've always read fairy tales, but I couldn't use them into the traditional fantasy, because there's a couple of books out there where they do, but they feel odd because traditional fantasy is not written in our world. So to pull in our folklore into our traditional fantasy doesn't work. So writing urban fantasy gave me a chance to use all of those stories and the weird ones. Like a lot of the library my mother started out working. She was the first librarian at the elementary school, and we had a little library that was books donated by people. And one of the things was like a 1920s book, and that was old even by my standards. I mean, it would have been the 70s when I was there, on the folklore of the Isle of Man. And that's where I have the story from the Dark Smith of Dronheim, where I based Ziebold Outerbuchschmeider off of it. And I have never, to this day, found another English language reference to the Dark Smith of Dronheim outside of that one story. And I had virtually forgotten it when I drew him up, but I thought it was cool character. That particular story was really weird because it was like all of the people had Celtic names, and then they would just randomly bring in these Germans, the Dark Smith of Dronheim, and there were others too. And there was no explanation for it. It was just looking as a history major, looking at the story. It was just this weird slice of what the Isle of Man went through, because it was settled by Celtics and Vikings and English, and it has this big lore too. And when I wrote Iron Kissed, where I needed to know about her background and have a really good understanding, I had a devil's own time running that story down. If it hadn't been for Project Gutenberg, where they take out of print stories or out of copyright stories and put them up, Project Gutenberg has that book on there.
Wow.
So I know now that in the world there must exist at least 2 copies of that book. One that was in the library, my elementary school library. I don't know where that is now. And the other one for whoever scanned it up into Project Gutenberg. And I'm bouncing around fairy tales now, but no, it's really fun to be able to use them. And Mercy has benefited from the book that she borrowed that turned out to be The Silverborn. And I'm sorry I gave that away, but that's pretty early in the series. Right. And she has benefited from that. Not stupid. so she's read a lot more sense.
Right. Yeah, well, it certainly has come in handy, and it's always fun when you come upon a passage about that, when she's saying, okay, well, in the stories, this kind of thing happened. And so that's kind of cool for those of us who, we're also fans of fairy tales, and even for people maybe who haven't read them, it makes them say, okay, let's go check that out. So maybe you're providing a gateway that way. So thank you. Now,
so one of the things that I really enjoyed, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I like that depth that provides the world. Yeah, I like that depth. I like the depth that provides the world. It's like in Star Trek when they use Shakespeare, right? It makes the world feel real. It makes it give it more depth. And sometimes I find out things I didn't know before, and that's fun.
Oh yeah, it's a different perspective, and that's something that any kind of reading we hope will provide, and that at least is for me. That's the way I feel about it. Now, speaking of our Mercy,
I think it's kind of like finding math in the wild. Go ahead. I'm just not on the top of you. Go ahead. Yeah.
That's okay. Now,
I'm waiting for you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now, as early as Bloodbound, as early in the series as that, we see Mercy developing a protective feeling, not just toward her friends, but of the Tri-Cities area already, in general already. And was it always your intention that she would take up the responsibility for that area that she did in Fire Touched, or was that something that kind of developed the closer you got to that point?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Attention is kind of a strong word. I think when I write, it's a decision. It's a series of decision trees, right? Mercy is a coyote shapeshifter, so Mercy's half Native American. In my head, predators are territorial. They just are. In the real life too. And my whole family laughs because I kind of base all of the werewolves off of my husband's family. They're very strong-minded, right? They're strong-minded. I'm not going to say they are violent, but let's say that that they all historically they came from a bunch of mercenaries and that kind of people. So and his dad was a Marine, and his uncle's a Marine. And so there's that kind of tension, that real tension and temperament that combines in these really wound up people, and they are very polite to each other. And because they're very polite to each other, everybody survives. And every single last one of them is incredibly territorial. So in my head, the werewolves are territorial and Mercy is territorial. I mean, that's one of her traits, being a predator, even though she's got it light. She's not as bad as the werewolves are. But yeah, she takes care of her own place.
Gotcha. Well, she certainly does. I mean, we've seen that over all these last several books since then, since she did make the claim that Adam shook his head over it. So yeah,
she's pretty embarrassed about that, but it works. Serves her right for having that staff.
Now, now I want to mention that for the next few questions, we will be discussing for our viewers. I want them to know that um, I can't imagine that people wouldn't have read Winter Lost yet
Right?
by the time this interview goes live. But I do want to mention that the next few questions will be about the book, and there probably won't be any terrifically huge spoilers, but I think I have about you know uh, 2 or 3 questions that have to do with that, and I will try to remember to say, okay, spoiler time over. So if people want to skip ahead a few minutes, then if they haven't read it when they're watching this,
Mhm.
we have given them fair warning.
Fair
Now,
enough.
one of the things, yeah, there you go. And one of the things I